1944 года. Остров Сайпан. The B-29 had not yet landed when the reports started coming in. 4 Japanese bombers. Mitsubishi G4M, what American crews called the Betty. They came in low, below the radar threshold, running dark, engines throttled back to reduce the exhaust glow. The crew of the lead aircraft had done this before. They knew the route. They knew the timing. They had studied the American patrol patterns and found, or believed they had found, a gap. They were wrong. What happened in the next 11 minutes over the waters north of Saipan would not appear in Japanese operational summaries. It would not be discussed at the debriefs held the following morning at Tinian. The 4 crews never filed a report. They never returned to file anything. Остановись на этом. 4 aircraft, 4 crews, approximately 40 men, gone in 11 minutes, in darkness, over open water. No distress calls, no survivors recovered, no wreckage that could be examined. The Japanese commanders who sent them knew something had gone wrong. They did not know what. And that was the problem that would consume the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service for the remaining 14 months of the war. Not the fact of the losses, but the silence around them. The Americans were killing aircraft in the dark, cleanly and completely, and the Japanese could not figure out how. To understand what those 40 men flew into over Saipan, and why the Japanese never found an answer before the war ended, we need to go back, not to the Pacific, and not to 1944. We need to go back to England, to the year 1936, to a chain of towers being built along the coast of a country that had just begun to understand what the next war would look like. Часть первая. The towers that saw in the dark. In the summer of 1936, a British scientist named Robert Alexander Watson Watt stood in a field in Suffolk and watched a wooden tower being erected. He was 34 years old. Before the war, he had been a meteorologist, a man who tracked thunderstorms, not aircraft. His path to that field in Suffolk had run through a memo he had written in February of 1935, a memo that answered a question the British Air Ministry had been asking in growing desperation. Could radio waves be used as a death ray? Could they kill a pilot at range? Watson Watt's answer was no. Radio waves could not kill a pilot. But, and here was the sentence that changed the war, they could find his aircraft from 80 miles away. Удержи эту цифру. 80 miles. In 1935, the most advanced optical rangefinder in British service could track an aircraft at perhaps 4 miles in clear daylight. Watson Watt was proposing something 20 times that range, in any weather, at any hour of the day or night. The Air Ministry gave him 3 months and a small budget. He built a working demonstration in that time. By February of 1935, a Handley Page Hayford biplane flying over the Northamptonshire countryside was being tracked on a cathode ray tube in a field below. The blip was crude. The range was imprecise. The system required 3 men and a generator the size of a farm wagon. None of that mattered. What mattered was that it worked. What Watson Watt had built was not new in principle. Radio detection of objects had been theorized since the turn of the century. German engineer Christian Holzmeier had patented a ship detection device in 1904. But Watson Watt was the first to build a system fast enough and precise enough to track an aircraft in real time and pass that information to a fighter pilot who could act on it. The system he demonstrated in 1935 would, within 5 years, be called radar, radio detection and ranging, and it would become the most decisive technology of the air war. But here is the detail that most histories skip past. Radar, in 1935, was a ground-based technology. It told you where an aircraft was. It did not tell the pilot of an intercepting fighter where to point his aircraft in the dark. There was a gap between the information the ground station had and the information the pilot needed, and that gap killed people. In the early months of the war, British night fighters equipped with ground-controlled interception data still had to find their targets visually. On a moonless night over blacked-out England, that meant flying within 200 or 300 yards of a target before you could see its exhaust glow. By then, if the bomber crew was alert, you were already in their gunners' sights. The solution to that gap was a second technology, smaller and cruder and far more dangerous to build: airborne radar. A radar set small enough to fit inside a fighter aircraft, with an antenna that could sweep the sky ahead and paint a picture on a small screen in the cockpit. Not a ground controller telling a pilot where to go, the pilot seeing it himself, in real time, in total darkness. The British called the first operational system AI, Airborne Interception. The Mark IV version entered service in late 1940. It weighed approximately 270 pounds. It had a maximum detection range of around 4 miles and a minimum range of around 400 feet, meaning that below 400 feet of separation, the target disappeared into ground clutter and the pilot was flying blind again. It required a dedicated operator, a second crew member who sat in the dark and read the scope while the pilot flew. The system was unreliable. The vacuum tubes failed in cold air. The antennas vibrated loose. The screen washed out in certain weather conditions. И всё же это работало. The first confirmed AI radar kill came on the night of the 23rd of July, 1940. A Bristol Blenheim of No. 600 Squadron, Royal Air Force, used its Mark III set to track and destroy a Heinkel He-111 over the English Channel. The bomber crew never saw the fighter. They had no warning. Their aircraft simply began to come apart in the dark. This is the template. Remember it. A crew that does not know it is being tracked cannot take evasive action. A crew that cannot take evasive action dies. The technology did not merely improve the odds, it fundamentally changed the nature of the encounter. Night interception was no longer a hunt, it became an execution. By 1941, the British had refined the system to the point where their dedicated night fighter squadrons, equipped with the Bristol Beaufighter, a twin-engine aircraft with a top speed of 321 miles per hour and 4 20mm cannons in the nose, were making the German night bombing campaign over England progressively more expensive. The Luftwaffe's losses to night fighters tripled between the winter of 1940 and the spring of 1941. The Germans noticed. They studied the problem. They built their own airborne radar systems, and in doing so, they validated the technology for anyone paying attention. The Americans were paying attention. In the spring of 1941, 18 months before Pearl Harbor, the United States Army Air Corps sent a technical mission to England. They flew in the back seats of British night fighters. They read the AI radar data over the shoulders of British operators. They came back with detailed notes and a very clear conclusion. Night air defense without airborne radar was guesswork. Night air defense with airborne radar was something closer to science. The Americans did not copy the British system directly. They built their own, the SCR-520, then the SCR-720, and they built it into a purpose-designed night fighter that would, within 3 years, become the most lethal nocturnal aircraft in the Pacific Theater. A black aircraft with a crew of 3, a top speed of 366 miles per hour at 15,000 feet, and 4 20mm cannons mounted to fire directly forward from the wing roots. They called it the P-61 Black Widow. But before the Black Widow reached the Pacific, something else was already there. Something older, cruder, and in some ways more interesting, because it reveals exactly how desperate and how creative American night fighter doctrine became in the years before the dedicated systems were ready. Познакомься с майором Дэниелом Хейлом Уайтом, 31 years old, from Greenville, South Carolina. Before the war, a crop duster pilot. A man who had spent years flying low and fast over fields at dawn, reading terrain by feel more than sight. He was assigned to the Army Air Force's first dedicated night fighter unit in the Pacific, the 621st Bombardment Squadron, a unit that was not actually a bombardment squadron at all, but a cover designation for night interception operations using modified Douglas A-20 Havoc light bombers fitted with early SCR-520 radar sets. White flew his first operational night patrol over Guadalcanal in January of 1943. The radar set in his aircraft was the size of a steamer trunk. The antenna was mounted in the nose, which meant the forward guns had been removed to make room for it. He was flying a modified light bomber, stripped of half its offensive armament, in total darkness over open ocean, using a technology that had been in American service for less than 8 months. Вот что упустили все. In his first 6 months of operations, White's unit established the pattern that would define American night fighter doctrine in the Pacific for the rest of the war. Not the specific technology, the technology kept changing. The pattern, the method, the way of thinking about night interception that made it so devastating. The pattern had 3 elements. First, ground control. A radar station on the ground, or increasingly on a ship, would detect the incoming aircraft at long range and vector the night fighter toward it. This gave the fighter pilot approximate bearing and altitude before he ever turned on his own airborne set. Second, airborne acquisition. Within 3 to 5 miles of the target, the pilot or his radar operator would acquire the aircraft on the SCR-520 screen and begin the final approach. This was the delicate phase, maintaining contact while closing the range, keeping the blip centered on the scope. Third, the kill pass. The fighter closed to within 150 to 250 feet, close enough to visually confirm the target type, close enough that a burst from the forward cannons was almost impossible to miss, and fired. The burst lasted between 1 and 3 seconds. Then the fighter broke away. 3 elements: ground vector, airborne acquisition, kill pass. Every American night fighter kill in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal in '43 to the final patrols over the home islands in '45, followed some version of this pattern. The Japanese had no answer for it. Not because they lacked intelligent officers, not because they lacked brave pilots, because the pattern depended on a technology they did not possess, could not quickly develop, and, this is the critical detail, could not defend against even when they understood what it was. Перечитай эту строчку еще раз. They could not defend against it even when they understood what it was. We will come back to that. Часть вторая. The men who flew in the dark. Saipan fell to American forces on the 9th of July, 1944. The island was secured at a cost of approximately 3,300 American dead and 13,400 wounded. Within 72 hours of the final organized Japanese resistance collapsing, CB construction battalions were already extending the airfields at the island's southern tip. By late July, those airfields were operational. B-29 superfortresses began arriving in August. The strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands, Operation Matterhorn's successor, the campaign that would eventually burn 67 Japanese cities, was beginning to take shape. And the Japanese, naturally, began to bomb the airfields back. The raids came at night. This was not an accident. Japanese air commanders had watched what American anti-aircraft guns and P-47s did to daylight raids in the preceding months, and they had drawn the rational conclusion: darkness offered cover. The Americans could not shoot what they could not see. The radar-directed anti-aircraft batteries were dangerous, but a low-flying aircraft below a certain altitude could duck under the radar coverage. Night raids were survivable in a way that daylight raids, by the summer of 1944, were not. They were wrong about the darkness, but they were right that daylight raids were suicide, so they flew at night. The unit tasked with defending Saipan's airfields was the 6th Night Fighter Squadron, Army Air Forces. They had arrived in the Marianas in June of 1944, flying P-61 Black Widows. The P-61 was not a subtle aircraft. It weighed, fully loaded, approximately 32,000 pounds, heavier than a fully loaded B-17 Flying Fortress of 1940. It had a wingspan of 66 feet. Its twin Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines, each producing 2,040 horsepower, gave it a sound that crews described as a low, distinctive throb that carried for miles on a quiet night. It was not an aircraft designed for stealth, it was designed for killing. The SCR-720 radar set installed in the P-61's nose was a significant improvement over the earlier SCR-520. Maximum detection range was approximately 5 miles against a bomber-sized target. Minimum range, The point at which ground clutter overwhelmed the return was approximately 500 feet. The set had a dedicated operator, the radar observer, who sat behind the pilot and read the scope. The three-man crew, pilot, radar observer, gunner, operated as a single organism. The pilot flew the vectors. The radar observer talked him in. The gunner, in a remote-controlled dorsal turret mounting 4 50-caliber machine guns, was the last line of defense if something went wrong. Познакомься со вторым лейтенантом Фрэнсисом Бёрном, 23 years old, radar observer, from Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, a radio technician, a man who had spent 3 years repairing commercial broadcast equipment in a small shop on the outskirts of Newark. He had been selected for radar observer training not because he was an exceptional pilot, he wasn't a pilot at all, but because he could read an oscilloscope and understand what it was telling him when it was malfunctioning. Byrne flew his first operational patrol over Saipan on the night of the 11th of August, 1944. His pilot was First Lieutenant William Dames, 26, from Detroit, Michigan, a former commercial airline co-pilot who had accumulated 800 hours of instrument flight time before enlisting. Their gunner was Staff Sergeant Roy Glover, 24, from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Остановись и подумай об этом. 3 men, combined pre-war experience, a radio repair technician, a commercial co-pilot, and a man who had worked in a Tulsa oil equipment warehouse. These were not the elite of American aviation. These were the American system, a system that took competent, trainable men and gave them equipment so good that competence was enough. On the night of the 11th of August, Dames and Byrne destroyed 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers within 40 minutes of each other. The first kill came at 11:47 p.m. local time at an altitude of 8,000 feet, approximately 12 miles northwest of Saipan. Byrne acquired the target at 4.2 miles on the SCR-720. He talked Dames through a textbook approach, 30 seconds of gentle course corrections, a final closure to 210 feet, and Dames fired a 2-second burst from the 4 20mm cannons. The G4M's port wing fuel tank detonated. The aircraft was gone in under 4 seconds. The second kill came at 12:23 a.m. This one was harder. The G4M crew had apparently seen the explosion of the first aircraft and was taking evasive action, sharp turns, altitude changes, throttle variations. Byrne lost contact twice during the approach. He reacquired both times. The final approach took 6 minutes instead of 30 seconds. Dames fired at 190 feet. Same result. Both Japanese crews died without knowing what killed them. Here is the forensic detail that matters. The G4M was not a helpless aircraft. It carried a tailgun, a 20mm cannon operated by a rear gunner. It carried beam guns. Its crew was trained to watch for pursuit aircraft. Under normal circumstances, a fighter attacking from behind and below would have been visible. The fighter's exhaust stacks glowed in darkness, and the G4M's gunners knew to watch for that glow. But the P-61's exhaust stacks were fitted with suppressors. The glow was reduced to almost nothing. The Black Widow approached in darkness, against a dark sky, at a closing speed that gave the G4M crew perhaps 8 seconds of warning, even if they had been looking directly at it. They were not looking directly at it. They did not know where to look. That was the point. Здесь ключевая деталь. The Japanese bomber crews were flying defensively, watching the sky ahead, watching for searchlights, watching for tracer fire from anti-aircraft guns below. Their threat model was built around what they knew. Guns on the ground, fighters that attacked from the forward hemisphere, searchlights that would give them warning. They were not watching the sky behind them for an aircraft they could not see, guided by a technology they did not know existed. The night fighters' lethality was not purely technological. It was partly psychological. The Japanese crews were flying into a threat environment they had not been trained to understand. By the end of August 1944, the 6th Night Fighter Squadron had filed claims for 17 Japanese aircraft destroyed over the Marianas. Japanese records, where they survive, confirm at least 11 of these kills. The remaining 6 are unconfirmed. The aircraft simply did not return, and no wreckage was ever recovered. 17 aircraft, 17 crews, in 30 days. Вот что поразительно. The Japanese continued the raids. Not because Japanese commanders were stupid, because they had no alternative. The B-29s on Saipan were destroying Japanese industry. The raids had to be stopped. The only tool available for stopping them was night bombing. So the raids continued, and the losses continued, and the pattern repeated. It is worth pausing here to understand the Japanese position. By the summer of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service was not the force it had been in December of 1941. The naval air groups that had attacked Pearl Harbor had been ground down through 2.5 years of attritional combat. Coral Sea, Midway, the Solomons Campaign, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, which Japanese pilots called the Marianas Turkey Shoot because of what American fighters did to them. The experienced crews, the men with hundreds of hours of flight time, the men who had trained since the late 1930s, were dead. Their replacements had, in many cases, fewer than 300 hours of total flight time. A Novi Equipage G4M with 300 hours of total flight time, flying a night raid over defended American airfields against an enemy equipped with airborne radar, had approximately the same chance of survival as a man walking into a dark room where he knows there is a predator, but cannot see it, cannot hear it, and does not know what it is. Approximately none. The Japanese losses mounted. The raids continued. The silence from the returning crews, or rather, the absence of returning crews, told the commanders what the debriefs could not. Something was in the dark. Если это расследование дает тебе более ясную картину того, как ночные воздушные операции выглядели на самом деле, не той версии, которая выжила в официальных архивах, а той, которую люди записывали, когда думали, что их никто важный не читает. Нажми на лайк. Это помогает удержать эту историю на виду чуть дольше, и это имеет значение. Часть 3. What the Japanese knew and what they could not do about it. The Imperial Japanese Navy was not ignorant of radar. This surprises people. The popular image of Japanese technology in the Second World War is one of sophisticated naval engineering and brilliant naval aviation combined with a strange blind spot around electronics. The image is not entirely wrong, but it requires precision. Japanese engineers understood radar in principle. They had been tracking British and American radar development since the late 1930s through technical intelligence channels. By 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had operational surface search radar systems aboard several of its capital ships. By 1943, it had experimental airborne radar sets under development. The problem was not understanding. The problem was production. Japanese radar development was hampered by 3 specific industrial failures, each of which compounded the others. First, vacuum tubes. The centimeter wavelength radar sets that made airborne interception practical, the SCR-720, and its British equivalent, the AI Mark 10, required vacuum tubes capable of generating microwave frequency signals. These were magnetrons, and manufacturing them to the tolerances required for reliable operation demanded precision machine tools and quality control systems that Japanese industry, in 1943 and 44, could not consistently deliver. American factories, drawing on pre-war commercial electronics manufacturing infrastructure, were producing magnetrons at a rate of approximately 50,000 per month by mid-1944. Japanese factories were producing them in the hundreds. Сосчитай это сам. 50,000 versus hundreds per month for a single component. Second, trained operators. Even if the Japanese had solved the manufacturing problem, they faced a personnel problem. Operating an airborne radar set in combat conditions required a dedicated crew member with weeks of specialized training. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service's training pipeline, already under severe strain from combat attrition, could not easily produce radar observers in meaningful numbers. The American system, which had identified this problem early and built dedicated radar observer training schools at Boca Raton Field in Florida and later at other locations, was producing trained operators at a rate that Japanese commanders would have found unbelievable. Third, and most fundamental, doctrine. Japanese naval aviation doctrine, as it had evolved through the 1930s, was built around the concept of the superlative individual, the elite pilot, trained for years, capable of extraordinary feats of airmanship. This doctrine produced the best fighter pilots in the Pacific in 1941 and 1942. It also produced a training pipeline that was too slow, too selective, and too dependent on individual excellence to scale. American doctrine was built around the opposite assumption, that the technology should be good enough that competent men could operate it effectively. This is why Francis Byrne, a radio repair technician from Cranford, New Jersey, could be a lethal night fighter radar observer. The system was designed for him. The Japanese system was not designed to be operated by men like Francis Byrne. It was designed to be operated by men who did not need it. A теперь самое важное. The Japanese knew by the autumn of 1944 that the Americans were using airborne radar on their night fighters. They knew this for a specific, documentable reason. They captured one. On the night of the 26th of October, 1944, a P-61 Black Widow of the 2nd Night Fighter Squadron was struck by anti-aircraft fire over Leyte Gulf and crash-landed on a beach in the Philippines. The aircraft was a write-off, but the SCR-720 radar set survived largely intact. Japanese technical teams recovered it within 48 hours. They examined it carefully. They understood what it was. They wrote reports that survive in part in post-war American intelligence surveys of captured Japanese documents, describing the system's operating frequency, its pulse characteristics, its approximate detection range. And then they faced the question that mattered. What could they do about it? The answer was very little and very slowly. One option was jamming. If you knew the radar's operating frequency, you could in principle broadcast noise on that frequency and blind the set. The Japanese developed several radar jamming systems during the war. The problem was installation and production. Fitting a jamming transmitter to every aircraft that might face night fighter interception required manufacturing hundreds of units and modifying hundreds of aircraft, a logistical challenge that the Japanese aviation industry, by late 1944, was in no position to meet. A second option was a radar warning receiver, a passive system that would alert a crew when they were being illuminated by a radar beam. This was technically simpler than jamming, and the Japanese did develop several versions. The most widely deployed was the E-27, a receiver that could detect S-band radar emissions, the frequency band used by the SCR-720. The E-27 entered limited service in late 1944. Остановись и подумай об этом. Limited service. Late 1944. The Americans had been killing Japanese aircraft with airborne radar since early 1943. By the time the Japanese had a working warning receiver in the field, they had lost hundreds of aircraft to the system it was designed to detect. And there was a deeper problem with the E-27. A radar warning receiver tells you that you are being illuminated. It does not tell you where the illumination is coming from. A G4M crew that received an E-27 alert knew a radar was looking at them. They did not know if it was a ground-based radar or an airborne one. They did not know the bearing. They did not know the range. They did not know whether the fighter was already inside their minimum visual detection distance. In practice, what the E-27 told a Japanese bomber crew was, "Something is watching you." It could not tell them what to do about it. Познакомься с капитан-лейтенантом Кензи Накамурой. 28 years old. A Mitsubishi G4M pilot with the 761st Naval Air Group, based at Truk and later at Clark Field in the Philippines. Before the war, a junior officer candidate from Osaka, son of a textile merchant, selected for naval aviation training in 1938 because of his exceptional spatial reasoning scores. He had flown operational missions since Midway. He was one of the most experienced G4M pilots remaining in service by the autumn of 1944. Nakamura's flight records, partially preserved in the archives of the Japan Center for Asian Historical Records, show that his aircraft was fitted with an E-27 receiver in November of 1944. He flew 6 operational flights, 44. He flew 6 operational missions after that installation. In his debriefs following each mission, he noted that the E-27 activated on every flight, meaning American radar, ground or airborne, was detecting him on every mission. On his 4th mission after receiving the E-27, he noted in his debrief, and this is documented, that the receiver activated at approximately the same moment that his rear gunner reported seeing a faint shape in the darkness astern. He took immediate evasive action. He survived that night. On his 6th mission, on the night of the 17th of December, 1944, his aircraft did not return. We do not know what the E-27 told him in his final minutes. We know it was not enough. Самая жестокая ирония вот в чем. The E-27 may have made things worse. A crew that knew they were being tracked, but could not locate the source of the tracking, was a crew in a state of high anxiety, scanning the darkness in all directions, unable to concentrate on navigation, unable to fly a smooth evasion because they did not know which direction to evade. Meanwhile, the P-61 crew, calm and methodical, reading the blip on the SCR-720 scope, was closing the range at a rate the Japanese crew could not perceive. The warning receiver told the Japanese crew they were in danger. The radar set told the American crew exactly where the danger was. These were not equivalent pieces of information. There is one more element of the Japanese response that deserves examination, because it reveals something important about the nature of the problem they faced. In the spring of 1945, as American night fighters extended their operations to the skies over the Japanese home islands, flying from Iwo Jima, from carriers, eventually from Okinawa, the Japanese attempted a tactical solution. They began flying their night raids at extremely low altitude, below 1,000 feet, sometimes below 500. The logic was sound. Airborne radar sets of the era had a minimum range problem. Below a certain altitude, the radar return merged with ground clutter and the target disappeared. If you flew low enough, you could, in theory, get under the radar coverage. It worked, sometimes. Not always. Because the Americans had anticipated this. The SCR-720's minimum range was approximately 500 feet in ideal conditions. In practice, against a low-flying target over water, where there was no ground clutter, only sea return, the set could track a target down to 200 feet of altitude. A G4M flying at 300 feet over the ocean at night was not invisible to the SCR-720. It was just harder to track. Harder to track, not impossible. И вот что упустили все. The low-altitude tactic had a second fatal flaw. A G4M flying at 300 feet over open ocean at night, in a damaged state, engines running rough, control surfaces hit, crew disoriented, had essentially no recovery margin. Aircraft that were hit at low altitude did not have time to recover. They went straight into the water. This is partly why the loss rate among Japanese aircraft attempting the low-altitude tactic was not lower than the loss rate at normal altitude. It may have been higher. The night was not a refuge, it was a killing ground. Часть 4. Вердикт. Вот криминалистический вердикт этого расследования. Japanese bombers stopped returning from night raids against American positions, not because of a single decision, not because of a single battle, not because of a failure of courage or skill among their crews. They stopped returning because of a systematic technological and doctrinal asymmetry that had been building for 8 years before the first P-61 Black Widow touched down on Saipan. Let us go through the elements precisely. The American advantage in night fighter operations in the Pacific rested on 4 interconnected pillars, each of which was necessary, and none of which was sufficient alone. The first pillar was the SCR-720 radar set. Developed from British AI technology, refined through 18 months of operational use in the European theater before reaching the Pacific, the SCR-720 gave American night fighter crews a detection range of approximately 5 miles against bomber-sized targets. This was not magic. It was engineering, specifically the engineering of the magnetron, a device that American and British industry could manufacture at scale and Japanese industry could not. By the time the P-61 was operational over the Marianas, The Americans had produced approximately 12,000 SCR-720 units. Japanese airborne radar production for the entire war totaled fewer than 1,000 sets, and most of those were installed in aircraft that were destroyed before they could be evaluated. 12,000 versus 1,000. The second pillar was the ground control network. Radar-equipped ships and ground stations vectored night fighters to within acquisition range before the fighter's own radar needed to activate. This meant the SCR-720 was not working alone. It was the last link in a chain that began 30 miles out. Japanese aircraft entering the defensive perimeter around Saipan or Guam were being tracked from the moment they crossed into range. The P-61 crew knew they were coming before the Japanese crew knew the P-61 existed. The third pillar was training. The American system for producing radar observers, beginning at Boca Raton Field in Florida, where the first dedicated night fighter radar observer school opened in 1942, had by the summer of 1944 graduated approximately 2,000 trained operators. These were not scientists, they were technicians, men like Francis Byrne, selected for aptitude, trained for 6 months, capable of operating the SCR-720 under combat conditions with a reliability rate that the Japanese system, even if it had the hardware, could not have matched with the personnel available. The fourth pillar, and in some ways the most important, was doctrine. The three-element kill pattern, ground vector, airborne acquisition, kill pass, was not improvised. It was developed, tested, refined through 2 years of night fighter operations in the Mediterranean and European theaters, and then exported to the Pacific with the units that arrived in 1944. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron did not arrive at Saipan to figure out how to kill Japanese bombers at night. They arrived knowing exactly how to do it. Остановись и подумай об этом. The Americans had been perfecting this exact method since 1942. The Japanese encountered it for the first time in the summer of 1944. By then, the gap in experience was 2 years wide. Now address the myths. The first myth is that Japanese losses to American night fighters were primarily the result of Japanese pilot inexperience. This is partially true and largely irrelevant. The loss of experienced Japanese naval aviators at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons campaign was catastrophic and real. But experienced pilots died to the P-61 just as readily as inexperienced ones. Kenji Nakamura, with 6 years of operational experience, died on his 31st mission. The SCR-720 did not care how many hours a pilot had logged. It saw the aircraft, not the man inside it. The second myth is that the Japanese had no answer to American night fighters. They had answers. The E-27 radar warning receiver was a real answer. Low-altitude tactics were a real answer. The problem was not that the answers did not exist. The problem was that the answers were inadequate and arrived too late. An E-27 without a countermeasure is a smoke alarm without a fire extinguisher. It tells you the house is burning. It does not help you put it out. The third myth is the most seductive, that the outcome was inevitable because of American industrial superiority. This is true in the aggregate, but misleading at the level of the specific technology. Radar was not an industrial product in the way that tanks or artillery shells were industrial products. It was a precision product, dependent on specific materials, specific manufacturing tolerances, specific engineering knowledge. The Americans had that knowledge because of Watson Watt, because of the Tizard mission that brought British radar technology to America in 1940, because of the radiation laboratory at MIT that developed the SCR-720 and dozens of other radar systems. The Japanese did not lack factories. They lacked the specific chain of scientific and engineering development that made centimeter wavelength radar reliable. That chain took years to build. They did not have years. And here is what happened to the men. Francis Byrne, the radar observer from Cranford, New Jersey, completed his tour in the Pacific and returned to the United States in early 1945. He went back to radio repair. He opened his own electronics shop in Newark after the war and operated it until he retired in 1978. Never spoke publicly about his wartime service. His records show 4 operational patrols over the Marianas, and one confirmed kill credited to the aircraft's guns. He returned to Tulsa after the war and worked in the oil equipment business until his retirement. He died in 2003. Kenji Nakamura, the G4M pilot from Osaka, is listed in the Japan Center for Asian Historical Records as missing in action, 17th of December 1944, over the Philippines. He was 28 years old. He left behind a wife and an infant daughter. His daughter, born in June of 1944, would not have remembered him. He had been at sea since before she was born. Думая о том, что это значило. Nakamura flew 6 missions with an E-27 receiver that told him, each time, that something was watching him. He could not see what it was. He could not find it. He could not outrun it. On his 6th mission, it found him. The asymmetry was not between brave men and cowards. It was between men who could see in the dark and men who could not. Robert Watson Watt, the meteorologist from Suffolk who answered a question about death rays and accidentally changed the war, lived until 1973. He died at the age of 81 in Inverness, Scotland. In his memoir, published in 1957, he wrote about the night interception problem with characteristic precision. The system, he argued, was not designed to kill aircraft. It was designed to eliminate the uncertainty that made night air defense impossible. Once you eliminated the uncertainty, the killing was simple. He was right. That is the coldest possible way to put it, and it is exactly correct. The Americans eliminated the uncertainty. The Japanese could not restore it. And in the gap between those two facts, 40 men disappeared over the waters north of Saipan in 11 minutes, on a night in 1944, without a distress call, without survivors, without wreckage that could be examined. They flew into a dark room where a predator was waiting. The predator could see them. They could not see the predator. That was never going to end any other way. И вот что должно остаться с тобой. The B-29s that those 40 men were sent to destroy flew their next mission on schedule, 2 nights later. Their bombs fell on Nagoya. The factories burned. The war continued. The 40 men are still out there, somewhere, in the deep water north of Saipan. The P-61 that killed them landed, refueled, and was ready for the next patrol by dawn. If this investigation gave you something you did not have before, a clearer picture of how the night air war actually worked, not the version that survived in official after-action reports, but the version that men like Francis Byrne and Kenji Nakamura actually lived, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next investigation. And remember, the most decisive weapons in history are often the ones that were never seen by the people they killed.